Hello, I'm Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special economic weather report from here at the Reserve Bank in Wellington, brought to you in association with the Bank of New Zealand, where today the Reserve Bank has just released its December quarter monetary policy statement and left the official cash rate on hold at 2.5%. Interestingly, it's also suggested that interest rates will stay there for quite some time. In previous statements, it said that the Reserve Bank is likely to increase the official cash rate back towards more normal levels once the emergency settings are no longer needed. Remember, it cut the official cash rate in March after the Christchurch earthquake in an emergency way, but it's been stuck there ever since. The difference is that the economic outlook internationally has deteriorated with the European financial crisis, and that's flowing through to New Zealand in the form of slightly lower demand for our commodities, slightly lower commodity prices, and the risk that funding costs for a lot of our foreign debt held through our banks will increase. It was interesting, the Reserve Bank focused on this a lot in its monetary policy statement and in the comments afterwards in the press conference. It said that this financial turmoil in Europe was increasing the funding costs for New Zealand's banks, and that may be passed on in the form of higher retail interest rates in New Zealand. The Reserve Bank said it would take that into account when it set monetary policy. However, when I asked Alan Bollard about this in the press conference and said if the banks increased their retail interest rates, mortgage rates and term deposit rates, would the Reserve Bank then cut its official cash rate to even out the effect? And he said no. But it's interesting, the Reserve Bank is focusing on these funding costs and the potential for a tightening by the banks as they pass on those funding costs to consumers in the form of higher interest rates, both mortgage rates and term deposit rates. Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank has also talked about the currency being fairly volatile and slightly lower, which has helped to soften the blow of the lower commodity prices on New Zealand consumers and on businesses. It's also talked about a potential alternative scenario. This is unusual, but the Reserve Bank has included a special box in the monetary policy statement saying what happens if we see a real meltdown in Europe. And it's talked about lower economic growth, lower inflationary pressures, and importantly, a flat official cash rate for the next year or two. Now, currently the Reserve Bank is forecasting that it will have to increase the official cash rate over the next year or two to a peak of around about 3.75%. Interestingly, it has lowered its forecast track for the 90-day bill rate by about 25 to 30 basis points over the next year to 2 years. What does all this mean? Well, if you're on a floating mortgage, staying floating will mean you can take advantage of any future cuts in the official cash rate. However, it does mean if the banks pass on the funding costs, then that would be passed on to you in the form of higher mortgage rates. Term depositors, again, the hope is that if those funding costs internationally increase and the banks are forced to rely more on term deposits, then they would push up those term deposit rates. We'll see. It's all an interesting equation involving bank profits too. Remember that bank net interest margins have increased around about 50 basis points in the last 18 months or so, according to Reserve Bank figures. And the question is, will they use some of that fat, some of that profit built up over the last year or two to absorb the blow of those higher funding costs? We'll see. I'm Hickey. That was a special economic weather report from here at the Reserve Bank in Wellington and brought to you in association with Bank of New Zealand.